need of further research.
Thank you very much. My term has expired. Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Goodwin, one of the soil health management principles you mentioned is optimized disturbance. You and I both know, but many of our colleagues might not, that prescribed burns, grazing, herbicide applications are actually beneficial for land if managed correctly. You even point out in your testimony that the Great Plains has lost some of its vast biodiversity because of limiting or completely removing fires and grazing. I guess my question is this: when talking about land use, can you explain why actively managing land is more beneficial to the environment and biodiversity than simply letting nature run its course?
Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. I think it's important. For us to understand the history behind how these ecosystems evolved. When we look at the Great Plains, or Southern Great Plains in particular, those systems evolved for thousands of years. The plants, the soils, the animals, all of them evolved under two primary natural disturbances: grazing, herbivory, and fire. Today, our producers manage those two disturbances with prescription. They manage the timing, the intensity, the frequency, the duration of that grazing event and that prescribed fire to benefit habitat management for a number of species. For instance, the timing of a prescribed fire might increase forage production for both game and non-game grassland bird species. And so understanding really the history behind it, plus also understanding that we need to educate policymakers and the growing public on the benefits of both grazing and fire in these systems. We used to have a fire culture in this country. We used to teach it in grade school. We don't do that anymore. I think we need to understand that if we understand those two items, then we've moved a long way into the future to helping biodiversity within that system.
And Mr. Goodwin, when talking about modern agricultural practices, you refer to this movement as being born out of innovation and economically stable practices. You say specifically that this is not born in a laboratory or formed by regulatory requirements. There's a fine line between doing things for people and doing things to people. Congress struggles to walk that line sometimes. Why is it important that these practices you discussed in your testimony be driven by producers and left unimpeded by regulation?
I think just like the diversity that this report is trying to protect, the agricultural landscape is just as diverse. We look across the U.S., we've got extremely diverse soils. We've got different climatic zones. We've got different production systems with different production capabilities. We even apply our practices differently depending on the location. And so, in short, when we look at farms and ranches, no two are equal. Different soils, different plants, different associations. So these regenerative solutions that were built by principles, they were built on that producer's innate ability to be innovative and doing things differently on their own without being asked or forced to. So as we look at policies that establish sort of blanket or one-size-fits-all regulation, we would largely end up with unintended consequences and ultimately limit our producers' freedom to operate and freedom to innovate.
Mr. Goodwin, neither you or I are old enough to have been in Oklahoma in the 1930s, in the Great Dust Bowl period. But in your testimony, you say producers began to experiment with farming techniques based on equal parts necessity and frustration. Can you elaborate on those frustrations, the lessons discussed, how we move forward, and compare where we are now on farms and ranches with where our ancestors would have been in the gut of the 1930s, the horrible part of the Dust Bowl in that period?
Certainly, the Dust Bowl was a terrible time. Families were decimated. So was the land. It was the formation of many organizations, mine included, as well as the Soil Conservation Service, as you well know. I think some of the frustrations we face is we need to keep in mind that farmers and ranchers, it's not Hollywood, it's a business. Some are large businesses, some are small businesses. And input costs over the last 60 years have increased to where those producers can't operate the way they've once were. They're business owners, and they need to have that ability to look for compelling ways to stay innovative. Those are some of the ways that have led to those frustrations, and really to abandon. They've moved them towards abandoning tradition of the last 60 years and looking for those compelling regenerative solutions that help them ecologically and economically, sustainably provide that food source for the growing public.
So essentially, whether it was for the right reason or the wrong reason, nonetheless, producers out there have been compelled to adopt a better path.
Most certainly.